Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good!
Oh, yeah? Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for checking out another new episode of The Lager Line, again served to you courtesy of Clutch City Lager of Carbach Brewing. I'm Ben DuBose, your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, and contributor to Sports Talk 790, official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. You can follow me on Twitter /X at Ben DuBose. I'm joined again tonight by my co-host and producer, Paulo Alves, who you can follow at Paulo Alves NBA. As we chat this Wednesday, November 6th, the Rockets are 4-3 after the first 7 games of the season. Back in action tonight, about to tip off against Victor Wembanyama and the hated Spurs over at Toyota Center. As for us here at the Lager Line, we have had a couple of mini-cast episodes the last few days that I've posted using my interview segments from 790, but this is the first show that Paulo and I have had since the regular season began. Definitely got a lot to get to. I know the mini-casts are not exactly the long form that you're used to. Well, that's what you're going to get today. And certainly there's a lot of highs and lows. The sample size, 7 games in, is large enough, I think, to have some real takeaways. We'll start with 30,000-foot view thoughts, and then as we move our way through the podcast, we'll do one area of concern, one area of encouragement for both myself and Paulo. We might have some back and forth in there, but I think to lead off, to me, the good outweighs the bad. The way I'm framing it, and, you know, there's a glass half full, a glass half empty way to look at it. The glass half empty would be they're 4-3, but it's a weaker part of the schedule. They've been favored in 5 of the 7 games, and the 3 games they lost, they were within a couple of points in the last 2 minutes of each of them. So you could easily be 5-2, even 6-1, 7-0, and you let some games slip away, and in a tough Western Conference, that could eventually come back to haunt you. I understand that, and for a team that doesn't yet have an established superstar, it is fair to sort of have a watchful eye on whether or not they can close out games that are really, really tight in the last minute or two. But for me, the good outweighs the bad, because the majority of that sample, and specifically the 3 losses, you had your 2 best players from last season, Alperen, Sengun, and Fred VanVleet, playing well below their standard. Sengun, his first 6 games, shooting below 40% from the field and becoming unplayable in the fourth quarter and overtime of most of those games, because if he's not shooting well, if he's not efficient offensively, then Ime Udoka is going to trust the lineups with Jabari Smith at the 5 and Tari Eason at the 4, because you have more defensive length, versatility, athleticism, floor spacing. So Sengun was your best player last year. He wasn't playing well. Fortunately, he did against the Knicks, and that's one of your most impressive wins of the season. Same can be said for Fred VanVleet. He was shooting below 30% overall, 30% on threes for the first 6 games. He shot well against the Knicks, and again, that's a game the Rockets won, despite the fact that they shot below 30% on threes. The Rockets out-rebounded the Knicks by 15 and ended up winning by double digits. And so rebounding, defense, I'm sure we'll get into it, Thompson, all of that leads to a very promising win over a good Knicks team. And I would actually argue that for this particular Rockets team, the upside matters a little more than the downside, because we saw last year, it felt like the first year of Ime Udoka, the Rockets had a lot of try-hard wins where they went out and grinded their way, but they couldn't beat the really good teams. To be able to go out and be 2-0 as underdogs with a couple of statement wins early in the year at Dallas, and then by double digits at home against the Knicks, even in a game that you didn't shoot well, to me, that shows you what I would call the upward mobility of this team, that they do have the gear that can get them to a level where they can compete with anybody in the league. And there's some questions because you don't have an established him to where you know who's going to be that go-to player every night, but you have so many potential hims that all it takes is 2 or 3 of them getting it going on a given night, and you should be fine. And again, the fact that they were able to hover at 500 despite Fred VanVleet and Alperen Sengun, probably your 2 best players from a year ago, being unsustainably poor, I think by and large that's a good sign. And now, even after a stretch in which, you know, we look at the 4-3 record and we say, wow, they should be better, But look, they're tied for the number 4 spot in the Western Conference. And there's only 5 teams in the NBA, I was looking at this earlier today, that have better point differentials. So I find it hard to complain too much about the record. I will say that we can only push back the record discussion for so long. And I think this upcoming schedule, 5 of your next 6 games against the Spurs, the Pistons, the Wizards, the Clippers twice. You've also got the Bulls and a back-to-back against the Trailblazers before Thanksgiving. You need to make some hay in that run. So while we're saying it's okay that they're only a game above 500 now, or at least I'm saying that, I do think by the time you get to closer to, let's say, the 20-game mark and the quarter pole of the season, they need to make some headway. But for now, when you consider how close they were in those games that they lost and how unsustainably poor your 2 best players from last season in Alperen, Sengun, and VanVleet were in those games, and you look at the Western Conference, there's only 3 teams that are better than the Rockets 4-3, which tells you that it's not like you're going to have to win 55 games to avoid the play-in tournament or something crazy like that. By and large, all the underlying metrics suggest this is a very good team. The record slightly lags that, but when you look at the performances to date, and now you're freeing up more minutes for Tari Eason as he's being scaled up and shows that he can handle the higher workload, and the young guys are getting better. It feels like Amen Thompson from one game to the next is improving. I would like to be 5-2, 6-1. I think they probably should be, but when you look under the hood, who they've played, how they've lost, the rest of the Western Conference, with them being at 4-3 and an easier stretch of the schedule coming up, I think by and large, I feel pretty good about where they're at.
First of all, let me just, get it out of the way. If my voice sounds different, I'm a little sick. If I have to take a break in between sentences, we'll obviously cut it out, but it's because I had to sneeze or something like that. So I'm kind of struggling with that just off the top. I'm fine, just so people don't find it weird. I'll also say, I actually have a lot of thoughts. I think this is one of the longest times we've gone, or one of the longest number of game stretches that we've gone without recording. I've got a lot of thoughts. I'm perfectly fine with the way things have gone. I think beating the Knicks and beating the Mavs in games, I didn't watch the Mavs game, but I looked into, obviously, the box score and the statistics later on. It felt like throughout the entire game, we weren't necessarily extremely, hot and then fell off, or the other way around. It felt like we consistently beat both of these teams throughout the game. And to me, that's a lot bigger of a statement than the game where we scored 17 the first half and then we struggled to score the second half. So those 2 wins against quality teams are pretty big statement wins. Our losses, the Charlotte game obviously just got out of hand. Obviously, what was problematic that game was offensive rebounding, and we didn't really have a go-to guy to score down the stretch. Jalen wasn't, the best, even though he had fine games. But we really needed Alperen Sengun, because I think Jalen's made tremendous strides this year as a defender, with how smart he is playing, the shots he's taking. But he is still not quite your, James Harden level solo advantage creator that you can just give him the ball in his spot and he'll get a bucket, right? Jalen needs to, get a good matchup, or have the other team give him enough space on the pick and roll so he can pull up for the 3. The closest thing he has to a go-to shot is the step back 3, and that's, hit or miss. It was hit in the Knicks game, but, obviously he's not an instant, the way, just off the top of my head, the way, CJ McCollum gets, or DeMar DeRozan get to their mid-range shots whenever they want, and that's shots you're fine taking. The way De'Aaron Fox gets to the rim, the way James Harden would used to, operate the pick and roll or in ISO and go into step back 3s. All of these guys have, their go-to moves that are reliable down the stretch in every single game, no matter what the defense is doing. Our guy for that is Alperen Sengun. Giving Alperen Sengun the ball in the post is our go-to, our most reliable way of generating an advantage in any given offensive possession. And it's the closest thing we have to someone who we can give the ball possession after possession down the stretch and close out a game. And because Alperen Sengun, up until this last game, hasn't been himself, and without him, we don't have that go-to way of generating buckets, you go through these really big offensive, spells where you can't score the ball at all. And unless you create a turnover or you can generate something in transition, you're mostly relying on threes, which are volatile, or just breakdowns in the defense, which are not happening quite as much. And so I think that's what caused us to lose some of these games or have so much variance between first halves and second halves. And so I think that's something that's fixable. I think, but from a 30,000-foot view, another reason why I'm fine with this is that, to me, in the West, the picture is very, very, very different from where it was last year. So 4-3 to me doesn't look too bad, even if the schedule is supposed to be easier. Because first of all, I think the Spurs are better. One of our losses, I think the Spurs are better than what people expected them to be. I think the Warriors at 6-1, that does not represent what they're going to be unless Buddy Hield is an MVP candidate from here on out. I mean, he's doing this every single game. And so you look at the top of the West, and I see one clear powerhouse, the Thunder, who can score with the best of them, and they've been holding many teams to under 100 points a game.
And unfortunately, Rockets play at the Thunder on Friday night, so that San Antonio game tonight is a big deal. But you're right, yeah, it'll be fun. And it'll be good to actually have a game where it feels like it's a bonus if the Rockets win, but not that harmful if they lose. Because so many of these early games, there's been so much pressure that it feels terrible if they lose because it's like, oh, we need to win these games looking at the schedule. Thunder game, it's a bonus and you get to see where you're at.
Yeah, and to me, to complete the point is I think the Thunder are in the upper echelon by themselves, then the Celtics, maybe the Cavs. I don't think the Suns being 6-1 is sustainable. I don't think the Warriors being 6-1 is sustainable. And teams, I think the Kings are not the powerhouse they were 2 years ago, and they're confirming the suspicions from last year that they're just an okay, can be a contender on a good day, probably just a playoff team caliber type of team. The Nuggets have clearly taken a step back. I mean, they're 4-3, but I'd say their play shows a worse record than that. Aaron Gordon is now injured as well. They've lost so many pieces. I don't think the Nuggets will be a contender this year. The Grizzlies are, just terrible defensively. Their stars have been in and out of games with injuries. I'm not sure what to make of them. The Timberwolves, to me, should be better than 4-3, but aren't. We just beat the Mavs. The Lakers, I'm not sure they're sustainably, a top-tier contender either. And so, to me, there's three teams ahead of the Rockets in record. The Suns, who I don't think are sustainable at all. The Warriors, who I don't think are sustainable at all. And then there's the Thunder. And so, to me, any seed, from what I've watched the Rockets play, and what I've watched the rest of the West play, any seed from 2 to 10 is up for grabs for any of these teams. And so I don't think the West is as tough as it's been in years prior. And so I'm not as worried about giving up these losses to teams that you're supposed to win against, because I think that this Rockets team is plenty good enough to beat the Lakers, plenty good enough to beat the Mavs, plenty good enough to beat the Wolves, plenty good enough to beat the Kings, plenty good enough to beat the Nuggets, plenty good enough to beat the Grizzlies, and good enough to beat the two seats ahead of the Warriors or the Suns on any given night. I mean, how terribly were we playing in the first 2 quarters against the Warriors, and we still came back through hustle play. It wasn't even hot shooting. We just hustle play. That was the entire difference from the first to the second half. And so, to me, I'm actually more optimistic than I was to start the season, because to me, the untouchable contenders have become just one. And I was expecting the Nuggets and the Timberwolves to be untouchable contenders, so they don't look like it. And the tougher playoff teams do look very beatable, basically all of them, no matter the talent. And so my 30,000-foot view boils down to, and I know I've gone a long time on this, boils down to, yes, it's 4-3 is not great, but all of these teams look beatable besides the Thunder. And so it's not ideal, but there's plenty of potential for the season to be even better than what I expected. Obviously, there's also potential for it to be worse, but we'll get into specific players later, but that's my general overview.
Yeah, I would largely agree with that. The obvious asterisk to put on that analysis is that in the next couple of weeks, I do think that if this team is capable of that type of leap from 11th in the West standings last year to getting, let's say, clearly in the top 6 and maybe playoff basketball without having to go through the play-in tournament, as I was referencing earlier, the Rockets by tiebreakers now apparently are at 4 in the West, although technically there's teams all the way from 4 through 9 that are all 4-3. Rockets do have the second best point differential of the bunch, so that's one source of encouragement. But we noted going into the year that this is where the schedule is lighter. I think if you look under the hood, you can find reasons, and the small sample, just 7 games to this point, for why the Rockets haven't gotten much separation. But when you look at the even weaker schedule coming up, the asterisk I would put on all this analysis is the Rockets do need to, by the time we're talking 2-3 weeks from now, to be at least a few games above 500 for this analysis to hold. But yeah, I do think in terms of projecting based on what we know to this point, there's a lot more to like than not like, because I mentioned Alperen, Sengun, and VanVleet shooting unsustainably poor. That, well, it's already started to turn around. We saw it in the win against the Knicks. And then that leads into my biggest area of encouragement, which is the increased minutes for Thompson and Tari Eason, and what that means for the Rockets relative to these other teams. Because I don't think, and we know the reasons that both of those guys are coming off the bench. There's some politics involved in terms of entrenched starters from a year ago. Also with Tari Eason, he's coming off of leg surgery. But the Rockets are in a unique spot where objectively, by any measure, 2 of their best players were not playing as much to start the season as they will be, assuming health, at the end. We all know Thompson and Tari Eason are going to get scaled up, and they already are. We've seen the last couple of games, they've been combining for about 60 minutes a game. To start the year against Charlotte, they played just 35. And I know internally that was a source of frustration. How do we get them more minutes? Now, some of it, Tari was playing at that point just 3 5-minute bursts per game, so he only played 13, 14 minutes, a little bit of nerves in his first real game coming off of leg surgery. But now that he is fully cleared, and I think that Warriors game, a blessing in disguise of the way that went down, the Rockets were certainly not going to take him out, even if he blew past their intended minutes total, with the historic comeback they were on. If the Rockets had completed it, being down 31, they did briefly take a lead and force it to overtime. It would have been the biggest comeback in franchise history. Of course, you're not going to pull Tari when he's posting a career-high 27 points and making an impact on both ends, hitting threes offensively and defensively, pressing the hell out of everybody, forcing turnovers, doing what he does in the open floor. He ended up playing 35 minutes in that game. And I do think that for the Rockets and for Tari, that was an important milestone. That's starters level minutes. And to see how he responded to that, how he felt the next day, and the fact that he was good to go, he was cleared to play in the next game on Monday against the Knicks, is a really encouraging sign. And so with Thompson in year 2, increasingly getting more minutes, as is the expectation, and we've seen taking on even more of a playmaking role late in close games. With Tari getting scaled up, coming off the injury, increasingly being freed to play more minutes. Ime Udoka said before the next game that there were no more limitations on him anymore. He is fully cleared. The Rockets are in a unique spot where 2 of their best players are were objectively playing less than they should be at the start of the season. We're already seeing them play more, and in my opinion, it's strongly linked with them playing better. They've won 3 of their last 4 games as of our recording time, and 2 of the 3 wins, they beat the Mavs and Knicks, 2 legitimate title contenders in the eyes of most around the NBA, and they nearly overcame a 31-point deficit in the Warriors, largely because of Tari Eason and Thompson. So the fact that the Rockets have 2 young guys that they can scale up the roles for as the season progresses, that gives them more upward mobility. That's the phrase I'm going to keep coming back to, than a lot of teams they're competing with. And we're already seeing them start to reap the rewards of that. Now, does it mean that down the road, one of them potentially needs to start to play them the minutes that they deserve? Maybe, but that's a conversation for another day. I think right now is just trying to maximize their minutes off the bench. Part of that was Tari just proving that he could be healthy. Another low-key thing, I like that Ime Udoka seems to have trimmed his rotation from 10 to 9. It's sort of alternated based on the game, whether it would be Reed Shepherd or Cam Whitmore that draws the short end of the stick, or maybe they just play 3 or 4 minutes in the first half. It was Reed Shepherd for a couple of games. Now Reed's looked better of late, so against the Knicks, it was Cam that drew the short straw. But the bottom line is, if you are trying to play 10 guys and you aren't starting Amen and Tari, it's going to be very difficult to get them both in the 25 to 30 minutes per game range. It's just very difficult if you're trying to play 5 guys off the bench and you're artificially limiting the minutes because you're saying that they're 100% not going to play in the first 6 minutes of the first and third quarters. So trimming the rotation a little bit. And I don't think it's giving up on either of those guys. Injuries are going to happen. Cam and Reed are going to have opportunities to play. 82 games is a grind. But in the short term, your ability to win games depends on maximizing the two-way play of Amen Thompson and Tari Eason. And so we are already seeing the Rockets start to do that more. And that's something that relative to the other teams in the West that they're competing with, that gives them a disproportionate advantage relative to other teams who largely are what they are. And that's not to say that that's the only way the Rockets can get better, but I think, the argument that, young players will improve, teams will get better chemistry-wise, that's always true. That's true of any team in any season, especially ones that have younger players, which the Rockets, we like the young core, but they're certainly not the only team in the West that has young players that can theoretically improve. What's different about the Rockets is that for reasons that are understandable, but real nonetheless, we're artificially capping the minutes for two of their best players early in the season. We are already seeing that start to go away, and I think that's strongly correlated with them being a better basketball team and playing better over the last week or so. So I think in the macro, that's my biggest area of encouragement. Anything that stood out to you, Paulo, aside from Amen and Tari, as far as real sources of encouragement from the first 7 games?
Yeah, so just to add a little bit onto what you said about Amen and Tari, Amen's defense on Jalen Brunson was some of the best I've ever seen any player play on anybody. Jalen Brunson can literally score in any way. He can go up and under, he will be decisive going to the mid-range, he can blow by you, he can pull up for threes. Amen Thompson is insane at cover, at not committing too early to any solution. And Jalen Brunson is it's so crafty that he's one of the toughest guys to guard because of that. A la DeMar DeRozan, for example, although DeRozan doesn't have the 3. And Amen Thompson did a tremendous job. Jalen Brunson had 29 points, so he didn't have a bad game, but he made basically every shot that he got.
Yeah, it took him 24 shots to get 29 points.
But I don't think I didn't feel watching when he was being guarded by Amen that he was generating any advantage. That was what I was trying to get to.
Agree.
And so I think he's one of the best defenders in the league right now. I think the Warriors game and the little bits of the Knicks game showed that he's transcending the Swiss Army knife type of player, and he's starting to show the ability to generate an advantage off the dribble as a lead guard, and then after generating the advantage, being able to finish around the rim. Now, obviously, with the Warriors game, some of those finishes were end ones and they were pretty wonky, and you don't know if the touch is quite that good. That there's variance there, but it's really encouraging if you're looking at the top end of his potential, which is as a lead initiator. Seeing that he can, last year he could get the advantage, but most of his buckets were him, grabbing rebounds and being the Swiss Army knife type. He was generating advantages these last 2 games, and I was really, really excited about that. And then with Tari, I was really confused to start off the season because it felt like this wasn't quite the same Tari Eason. He wasn't as intense. And then the Warriors game came, and he was as intense as ever. And the Knicks game came, and he was once again as intense as ever. And I think I truly came out of these games thinking, I don't think the conditioning's dead yet. And that's why he didn't start off the season to his typical level, which is, transcendence role player level. I think you guys know, if you've listened to the pod over time, that how high I am on him. So I just want to say, it feels like he's back, and it feels like because he was without playing for so long and without playing at full strength for so long, that it's more of a competitive intensity thing where he's getting there. He's not quite there, and these last 2 games were the closest that he's been, and we saw the impact that he had. And so I was scared to begin the season that, maybe the injury had zapped a little bit of the intensity that he had, but no, that's completely back. And that's great to see because, as I said, he was one of my keys for the season. Besides that, the other bright spot that I would point to is, because we have to say this, and I think we haven't mentioned, obviously because we haven't, I think this was more of a talking point before the last couple of games, but it should still be a talking point because of how good the games before that were, is Jalen Green. Jalen Green has made good on a lot of his potential. I think he's been tremendous defensively. I think he's making the right threes and taking the right shots. And you're going to look at the box score, and especially if you are maybe an older fan, and you're going to look at 15 threes in the first game, and you're going to say, oh my God, it took 15 threes and he made 5 of them. And you're going to think that, that's not a great game. He was checking out there. Truth is, when he's shooting a lot of threes, they are coming within the rhythm of the offense. He's getting them off of the pick and roll, off of screens. They are open threes. He has to take those shots. And his efficiency wasn't bad enough for it to say, 33%. I did the math. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but for an offense that's, obviously I think they're rated top 10 right now, but for those first 2 games, the Rockets offense wasn't better than what Jalen Green shooting 33% on threes from a points per possession standpoint, what that would bring. From a points per possession standpoint, shooting 33% on threes means you're getting 1 point per possession, which is, pretty good. And if you could get 1 point per possession across a game, it wouldn't be ideal, but with the level of defense that the Rockets are playing, you'd be fine with that. So compared to the shots we were getting, Jalen, I think, has made strides on that as well. I think you can look at the Knicks game where it was not a good game from him. He was not making shots, and these teams that bring a lot of ball pressure still bother him. But to close out the game, he had 1 clutch catch and shoot 3, 1 clutch step back 3, a clutch dump off pass, which ended up being an assist to Thompson in that fake that man does to the corner and then gets a wide open dunk. That he makes that pass, and then the play before, or a couple of plays before the end transition, he hits Tari Eason to extend the lead, which is a contrast to if you roll back the clock to the Spurs game, where he had a similar transition pass to Cam Whitmore, and he missed him. He threw the ball behind him, and Cam couldn't, obviously turned into a turnover. So I think Jalen has been incredible. I think he's been well worth his contract thus far. The last couple of games have kind of tanked his efficiency a bit, but I still think that he's been great. The process has been awesome, and he's still not, a consistent advantage creator against all defenses, but against a lot of defenses, he is creating a lot of advantages, and it's clear the difference between when he's playing and when he's not playing in most of these games. So I just wanted to point to Jalen as another one of the bright spots, in addition to Tari and a man who are the clear bright spots.
Yeah, I would largely agree with that analysis. However, it leads into my area of concern, which is something that honestly traces back to the end of last season. And it's what the Rockets do offensively when other teams are focused on taking Jalen out of the game. It could also be if Jalen's simply having a bad game. But I think by and large, we've seen, and the Knicks game is a perfect example, Jalen doesn't fade the way he used to. He keeps playing, and I thought it was great to see Ime trust him, and Jalen rewarded him with a couple of big shots late in that game. So I think by and large, Jalen's not the guy he was at times in his first 3 years, where if he misses his first 2 shots in the game, he's going to stop shooting, he's going to get passive. No, I think he's much more confident. Tom Thibodeau said that before Monday's game. I think Tibbs is one of the best defensive tacticians in the NBA. I thought that was pretty telling coming from him. So I'm not so much worried about Jalen himself, but there are going to be games, as with any player, that he doesn't shoot well. And more importantly, I think there are going to be games where other teams, especially if he has it going, try and blitz the pick and rolls hard, send additional help, or maybe it's just like the Warriors with Andrew Wiggins and the Knicks between, Josh Hart, Mikal Bridges, OG Anunoby, a lot of long, rangy types that can give Jalen problems. You addressed that briefly. When Jalen isn't able to get you to the finish line, what is plan B for the offense? And I shouldn't even say finish line, because this happens in the first half. That's honestly what you look back at that Warriors game, and the one outlier for the Rockets over the first 7 games, that first half against the Warriors, when they fell down by 31. And some of it, the Warriors were just unconscious from 3. They made 9 of their first 11, and the Rockets, I think, missed their first 8. And so some of that is shot luck. But it's also the Rockets just did not execute. They scored 43 points for the half, and a lot of it felt like when the Rockets couldn't get Jalen going for one reason or another, and the Warriors did exactly what they did late last season. After the Rockets had that 11-game winning streak, they got back into the play-in mix. We know what happened the last week of March, first week of April. They lost 3 in a row. to Western Conference heavyweights, the Mavs, the Timberwolves, the Warriors, and it felt like all the game plans were fairly similar in that those teams were not going to let Jalen beat them the way he did most of the NBA during that incredible month of March. And especially with Alperen and Sengun out at the time, it just made sense for teams to approach the Rockets in that manner. So we've seen that happen early in the year, and I think especially when Sengun was playing poorly, it was even easier to do that, because if Shingun's not making his shots and Ime Udoka isn't even trusting him enough to put him on the floor late in the second half of competitive games because of the potential defensive liabilities compared to the Jabari at the 5 lineups, then why wouldn't you try and slow Jalen in the half court and dare one of these other guys to beat you? And so that, to me, is still the question the Rockets have to answer. In theory, the answer is pretty obvious. Alperen Sengun, on paper, is your best advantage generator, as you put earlier. But I do think that late in close games, the Rockets need more reps with Sengun out there in high leverage moments so that they can get used to how the offense actually flows. Because I think, against the Knicks, so the Rockets won that game by 12. That's great. But honestly, a lot of it came down to Jalen making a couple of really tough shots at the end of the game. The stories will tell you, Sengun scored 10 points in the fourth quarter, but it was generally early on and on putbacks, and he crashed the offensive glass, which is great. I don't think the Rockets, especially down the stretch, the final 5 or 6 minutes, made a concerted effort to run offense through him. Now, some of it, the Knicks had Anunoby on Sengun, and so he tried to front a little bit, but there are ways you can counter that, and it felt like the Rockets didn't even really try. They defaulted to what they've been doing with the Jabari at the 5 lineups, which is get the ball to Jalen up top and run some sort of screening action and use Sengun out of the dunker slot more as a diversion than actually being part of the action. And to me, that's what's got to change, because Jalen is not to the level, as you said, of someone like James Harden, where regardless, he will get you to the finish line every time. He has done an admirable job of making plays and tough shots to this point in the season, but I think as the competition gets steeper, he's not to that level just yet. He's getting better. It's a part of why other teams are defending him much more aggressively, sending more help. And so by and large, I think Jalen's contribution is clearly much better this year than last. I think most of the jumps since the All-Star break that we've talked about, throughout the preseason after he got his extension in the last spot, all of that is real. By and large, it's been an encouraging 7 games for him. But in terms of what it means for the Rockets, I think the question's going to be, what do they do when other teams, and it's going to become even more of an issue if the schedule gets tougher and if Jalen gets it going, make a concerted effort as games get more close to take Jalen out of the action and dare someone else to beat them. And so that's where I want to see some more creativity from Ime Udoka with his schemes. And I honestly think a lot of this will just come down to having more reps with Sengun in high leverage spots, period. I think some of what happened against the Knicks was probably that the Rockets just didn't have much experience with Sengun on the floor in high leverage games this season, so they didn't know how they wanted to attack and run the offense in those stretches because he hadn't been out there. It's been almost exclusively Jabari in the close and late situations. And so with that, then yeah, you're going to have the high screen action involving Jalen as your go-to play. Whereas now, and I should say they've had some possessions with the men Thompson starting to create, and so there have been some promising signs on that, but you haven't really run offense through a playmaking big man. To me, that's the counter, especially as the schedule gets tougher. And so it's something I want to see Ime Udoka, point out on film, and, there's various ways they can swing the ball and get it to Sengun in his spots. But I also think some of it's got to be, just trust Sengun more in the fourth quarter and play the long game. Again, I understand why Sengun got benched from time to time in those first 6 games. If he's not shooting well, that he's not giving you enough offensively to sort of offset the defensive limitations. But at some point, to get where the Rockets want to go, if they want to actually get to the playoffs and perhaps even win a series down the road, they need to have the right version of Alperen Sengun. There's a reason you're paying him in your max salary. And so to unlock that version of LP, it's going to take not just reps for him. I'm sure LP is still confident. He's said that. But it also depends on other guys knowing how to best play with him on the floor in high leverage moments. And so I think the Knicks game was a starting point to that. I think there are things that they could learn from that. But in the games ahead, I hope that if not just for that game in and of itself, for the long run, the Rockets emphasize playing Alperen Sengun late in close games simply as a teaching point for how the other 4 guys on the court with him can sort of use him to unlock some of those defenses that, are increasingly paying more attention to Jalen Green. So I say that as a concern, not to say that the Rockets can't overcome it. On paper, they definitely can. I just think it's something that, for the most part, they haven't done. And even in the next game where you look at the box score and you'll see that Sengun scored 10 in the fourth, look at how he scored those points. It doesn't feel like late in the game, the Rockets knew exactly how they wanted to use him in their half-court offense. And so the Knicks forced Jalen into some very tough shots. Thankfully, he still made them. But I think as the games move forward, you want to see Sengun leading on a little more heavily in those spots. And so concern might be strong, but that's my area of monitoring as these next couple of weeks progress. Paulo, what are your thoughts on that dynamic and any other areas you've seen to this point that concern you a little bit?
Yeah, I'm with you. I think the clutch, our clutch offense has definitely been a problem. And we basically play as well as our defense allows us to play. If we are generating turnovers and catching the other team off guard, we are finding it easier. There's been a couple of spots where we've had the Spurs game with Jalen, consistently beating his man off the dribble. We've had, I think, with the Knicks game, we had, a couple of possessions where they were intentionally feeding the post with Sengun, and Sengun was making it work, especially when they were targeting Carl Anthony Towns because he had 4 fouls, if I'm not mistaken, at the time. Obviously not at the very end of the game, but, that pre-clutch time. And it seemed to work, and it seemed like Alperen Sengun had his touch back because he wasn't scoring exactly, with go-to moves. He was getting bumped a lot and he was finishing through it rather than, the clean hooks and the clean spins and the layups, right? And so it felt like his touch was back, even if he wasn't generating the advantages that he usually does. He is definitely the clutch. I agree with you. My negative point is definitely what our clutch offenses look like. But other than that, I think you have to point to Fred VanVleet. I think he's shooting us out of games way too often, and it's sometimes hard.
He's playing for wins, not for Twitter. Did you see that post-game quote?
I did not. Did he say that?
Amazing quote. I'm playing for wins, not for Twitter. Yeah.
I mean,
he needs to go out with a merch line for that. But anyway, go on.
He should. I mean, he did have that really, really clutch three. I believe it was against the Spurs, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. The 1-2 pick and roll action that they used a lot late last year when Jalen got going, and Jalen actually called it their go-to play after the game. So yeah, he did make that shot, even though he struggled for much of that game and really much of this season, the Knicks excluded.
Yeah, and actually, I think I looked at his stats like 4 games in, and his 3-point percentage was actually not as bad as it looked. But then, obviously, the Warriors game was just terrible. The next game was a little bit better, but if he's going to be taking those shots, he has to be making more of them, and we can't be okay. Like, I struggle to look at those plays, and I tweeted about this when I was tilted about the Warriors game, but whenever we're faced with teams that are kind of face guarding us, he can't blow by people, and when he does get by the primary defender, he's so short he cannot do anything at the rim. And so when the three isn't falling, there's really not much else to his game, unless it's just getting the offense in motion. And when our plays are getting face guarded, Jalen against the Warriors getting hugged before he even got the ball. Freedom of movement was not a thing, and when the offense looks clunky like that, and he is forced to just dribble into like, he's so short, he's dribbling into guys' like laps, and it's really frustrating because there's no chance in hell he's getting a shot off, even less so an efficient shot. So with him, he's a really good floor general, he's a good vet, right? But going into, if this doesn't get better as the year goes on, that pay cut's gonna hit big, because he's not worth the money that he's currently making, and obviously you offset that with some of the guys being better than their rookie contracts. But it's a very real problem that he's not shooting well, he's not generating good looks. I think his assists are way down this season as well. Obviously he's still running less pick and roll with Sengun, which obviously is going to decrease his assist numbers, but he's definitely my number 2 when it comes to kind of negative things. And obviously, I don't think Reed has been great. I don't think Cam Whitmore's been great. But they're playing such little roles that I think it's hard for us to really project anything out of the first few games that we've watched. So I will definitely lock into our clutch offense and Fred VanVleet, just his play in general. Obviously, he was fine against the Knicks, but I mean, if you're gonna have 5 terrible games in one hot shooting game, it's not gonna be good enough. And Ime down the stretch needs to be willing to, when Fred's not playing well, to not play him, because he's not enough of a defensive plus to offset how terrible he is on offense sometimes. And if we're not gonna work in the half court anyways, you might as well just go full on defense, try to generate turnovers and score off of them. As crazy as it sounds, I'm probably more confident with Tari Eason driving the ball in his weird, dribbling with his left hand, kind of doing a large circle around the defender, bumping into him all the way to the rim. Probably collapses defense better than Fred, going around the screen and just bumping into the first defender that is in front of him. And then, obviously, because he's so small, he gets cut, like the guy stretches his arms around and over him, and he spends 4 seconds doing that. Obviously, he was never a player without deficiencies, but he's, to me, basically unplayable if the 3-point is not at least at a 36% rate. And it's, I think, at 27 now, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think I know he trusts Fred, but he needs to be willing to let that go when he's not playing well enough. And he hasn't been playing well enough, and he's been playing a lot of minutes regardless.
Well, and I would say, as an extension of that point, I think that if the rotation stays at 9, which it feels like it's mostly been the last few games, I think that even more tips the scales towards Reed Sheppard over Cam Whitmore, because Reed is someone that, as the year progresses, can be something of a drop-in replacement, at least to some capacity, depending on the matchups. Obviously, there are some where Reed, as a rookie, might be a little bit of a defensive liability. But I think we've seen Reed improve definitely the last week compared to the first week. He looked a little raw. He looked a little nervous. He also had a back injury early in the year. Now he looks a lot more confident. He's hit some big threes the last 2 games. I think the ability of Reed to do many of the same things that Fred does, if he doesn't turn it around, if it does turn out that some of this is, a guy who's now in his 30s and has been leaned on very heavily over his career, if Fred doesn't get back to the guy he was a year ago, that I think having Reed available and ready, which he's only going to get more ready by playing, it's a very useful hedge in a way that Cam Whitmore, it's not just about comparing Reed to Cam, it's also what is their role potentially going to be on this year's team. And there's other guys with similar body types to Cam Whitmore that play the same roles. Not saying they have the same style of play. Obviously, there's things that Cam does in terms of just the fluidity and the power that his athletic profile allows him to make plays in transition that very few other guys on the roster can do. But you do have other guys that can fill a similar role and absorb those minutes, as opposed to if Fred is something of a liability unexpectedly, and you have to at least keep your mind open to that possibility as guys get into their 30s. I think that's part of why the Rockets have a team option on Fred's deal after this year, because they aren't 100% sure exactly how he's going to age. In that scenario, there's more utility to developing Reed and having him because he can handle the ball, he can play something of a similar role than there is Cam, because there are other guys at, the 2, the 3, the 4, basically the wing spots, which is where I think you would pencil in Cam. And so because of that, I think for this team, that should make Reed a little bit of a higher developmental priority. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and the better Reed is, the more leverage you have in a contract negotiation with VanVleet.
True.
Moving forward as well. And I think the vision is that ultimately Reed, takes over that spot eventually. But I'm also confident that, and I mentioned this earlier in the pod, I'm confident that when Thompson can be trusted to run some of those actions, and for a season in which it was clearly stated that the intention was for Fred VanVleet to play less minutes than last year, he's playing more. He was at 36.8 last season. He's at 37.6. He's playing nearly a full minute more than he was, and he's not playing close to the same level. He was 42, 39, 86 splits last season. He is 32 28-85 splits this season. Like, it's a jarring difference, and I'm not sure he's a positive on the floor if he's not, shooting at least 36% from three, and that's already a downgrade from what he was last year. And I understand all of the intangible value that he brings, but as this team matures, that intangible value decreases, and so you can't have the intangible value decrease and your play on the court decrease as well. So yeah, Fred's definitely been underwhelming, but hopefully he can pick it up.
Yeah. And I guess as we transition to our final segment of this week's pod, we'll call this miscellaneous because we've been through areas of encouragement and concern. We've been through 30,000 foot view thoughts. So this will be miscellaneous, basically the news and notes. But the one guy I want to make sure we show some love to is Dillon Brooks. I don't want this to be one of those pods where it's so easy for Rockets fans to fall in love with the core seven, and whenever a veteran plays poorly, just say, oh, we need to discard him and give more minutes to the young guys. Because we all know that over the next few years, that's probably where the Rockets go, and some of these young guys will get phased out, or some of the veterans will get phased out, But for this season, the stability of guys like Fred and Dillon and perhaps Steven Adams, who's still working his way back, is important for a number of reasons. And if Fred has underperformed a little bit to start this year, I would say that Dillon has overperformed. Not necessarily in the shooting, that's been hit or miss, but defensively, his ability to guard bigger guys like Wemby, like Karl-Anthony Towns, is so valuable for this team. He's starting to look like the way the Rockets used PJ Tucker on those great teams in the late 2010s. Dillon still has the juice on the perimeter. He's at times held his own on switches, and he's looked a little more fluid than he did playing with the oblique strain for the second half of last year. We talked about that in the preseason. But his ability to also guard the bigger guys, respectively, is really important on a team that has a lot of youth and a lot of question marks when it comes to the front court defensively. We know the concerns with Alperen and Sengun, and if he's not playing well, Jabari at the 5 is really light. He can still get pushed around. You can play Steven Adams if he's healthy, but A, he's not always healthy, and B, he's not the most mobile guy. So he's a little bit limited in terms of the matchups where he makes sense. And Thompson is so good on guards. We saw what he did against Jalen Brunson. And so his ability to move side to side, the shiftiness is uniquely important in putting him on the best perimeter player on the other team. To an extent, that can be said with Tari Eason as well. The obvious question is, if you're using them more on the perimeter to guard those smaller playmakers that are creating off the dribble and trying to stop the dribble penetration, then who's going to guard the bigger guys? And that's where having a wing like Dillon, who can certainly shoot, but can sort of scale up defensively, is really important for this team. And the combination of the defensive limitations of the front court guys they have in place, Jabari with the lack of bulk, Sengun with the issues we've talked about ad nauseum for years with regards to the foot speed and how mobile is he, and wanting to use guys like Amen and Tari more on the perimeter to stop the dribble penetration. And I think also, Fred VanVleet, even though he's the smallest player on the floor when he plays, he's not exactly a guy you trust to stop dribble penetration anymore. Now that he's in his 30s, he's not that side-to-side guy. So that's another reason why you need to use Amen and Tari and guys like that more up top, Jalen Green as well, than having someone like Dillon Brooks that can guard the bigger players and absorb the pounding. I mean, quite frankly, to play 30-plus minutes a night and bang with someone like Karl-Anthony Towns, that takes a lot out of you. And so for Dillon to be able to do that on a frequent basis, I think is uniquely important to this team and the way they're put together. And so I think a lot of Rockets fans are sort of rolling their eyes at Dillon a little bit because they look at the three-point percentage being a little bit lower than they would like. But when you look at what he is giving them defensively, if Fred is underachieving to this point, which I think is a fair assessment through 7 games, I would say overall Dillon is overachieving based on the value of his versatility on defense. So I guess that'd be my final point for this pod. Let's give Dillon Brooks his flowers. I think he's had a low-key, very important role in their start through 7 games. Paulo, what other news and notes do you have as far as the rest of the roster and anything else you want to throw out?
Yeah, I would say that I'm with you on Dillon Brooks. Obviously, the shots have not been falling, but this team has been using, as you said, the wings to guard on ball, which means that we're left with guys that are not doing too great defensively in Jabari Smith-Jr. and Alperen Sengun to guard those, those star bigs. And I think it's a really interesting analogy to PJ Tucker because I do agree, although Dillon seems to have a lot more offensive responsibility than Tucker does. But regardless of that, I wanted to talk about Jabari Smith Jr. as a little bit of a low point. I think his best game was in the win against the Spurs. I think a lot of people will point to that Warriors comeback, but the truth is he was a part of the problem as well, and he was later a part of the solution. But it's just a bit frustrating to me how uncoordinated he is when he moves. Like, he can make stuff that's simple look hard. And he's obviously come a long way from his rookie season, but it's really tough, because even coming a long way from your rookie season when it comes to dribbling and finishing at the rim and your overall coordination and your movements, even coming a long way on those doesn't mean that much because you were so awful at them earlier in your career. What really hurts is that you were supposed to be a knockdown shooter. The one redeeming quality of why you were such a safe pick was that you were, a dead-eye knockdown three-point shooter, and that's just not been the case. He's shooting 30%, I call it 31% for the season. Even 35% is not enough. He doesn't bring enough in other areas of the game to not be at least a 38% three-point shooter. And he's just not close to it. Last year, it looked like he was getting better, and now, hopefully, this is just a cold start, but the shot looks flat again. I don't know if he's still using the Noah. I think Noah is the name of the system they have at this facility. I don't know what it is. All the Rockets have gotten their shots better. Jalen Green shot looks better. I just, I don't know what to say anymore. And it's frustrating because Jabari could be such a huge piece of this team. Like, look at how much better we look in the stretches when we play him at the 5 and we go into those full-on, switch defensive lineups. If Jabari Smith could reach what he was supposed to be, which is a 3 through 5 guy that can switch and knock down three-point shots, think Robert Horry, for example, that would be massive for how versatile this team is. And truth is, I think if it were not for his, draft capital pedigree of sorts, Tari Eason is clearly a better player, and Amen Thompson is clearly better as well, especially now that you're kind of comfortable moving Dylan Brooks to the 4. Like, they are clearly better. And when you talked about earlier in the podcast on how this team was struggling to find ways to give Amen and Tari minutes, I don't think that those minutes are going to end up coming from Jalen. I don't think that those minutes are going to end up coming from Alperen Sengun the way they have thus far. I think those minutes are going to end up coming from Jabari because he's not playing well enough. And if you look at the Knicks game, he played 22 minutes. And that was, the Golden State Warriors game was kind of an outlier because the rotations were completely out of sorts. And so the man and Tari played, a ton of minutes, but it wasn't sustainable. The rotation was never going to be, you don't play Sengun for basically an entire half. The Knicks one looked a little bit something that's more replicable, and in that Knicks game, Jabari played 22 minutes, and I think moving forward, he's going to be the one who, until he steps up his play, is going to be giving up his minutes so that we can play him and Tari will look amazing.
Let me ask you as a quick follow-up to that before we wind down the pod. What's the point of the year at which you would consider, let's say, the team is underperforming a little bit in its win-loss record? I don't think you're going to, if the wins are coming, I don't think you're going to take away from what's working. But if for one reason or another you're underperforming where you think you should be, and Amin and Tari are objectively better players than Jabari, and one of Jabari's most valuable roles is as a 5 rather than as a 4, so maybe it makes sense to have him on that second unit where he can fill in for Sengun in certain matchups where either Adams needs a night off or maybe Adams is just too slow. At what point is it 20 games? Is it 40 games? Is there a point where you would pull the plug, and what would it take to say, you know what, Amin and or Tari is so clearly better than Jabari or a better fit next to Sengun that I've just got to bite the bullet and play who I think is better? We're not there yet. I don't think we're there at any point, I would say, barring injury, before the calendar turns to 2025. But what's the point where you would consider something on that front?
Are you talking about starting?
Tari or N in place of Jabari? Yeah.
So, but starting in specific, because I was curious if you meant, the step towards removing him from the starting lineup versus just taking minutes away. I think the way these lineups line up, you should be able to, it's tough to give Jabari minutes at the 5 because Steven Adams contributes so much. And how are you going to play Sengun and Steven Adams? And Jabari going to struggle to do that. But I would still, and it's not because of punishing how Tari has been playing, but I think you can play him 22 minutes. I'd be willing to start, go along with the next game and the next few games, play him 22 minutes a night, but he can still start. And it's not about Jabari, it's actually about the bench unit. Because I think the bench unit needs a man in Tari to be good enough. And so, with Jalen and Sengun and I mean this offensively as well. With Jalen and Sengun on the floor for the first 6 minutes of the half, you're fine offensively. And when those guys eventually come off, you're going to need Man and Tari to be playing. So I think ideally, and I would have no problem starting doing this now. But I think this is both the solution now and the solution long term until Jabari starts to play well. I don't think the solution is going to be eventually not starting him. I think it's just decreasing his minutes while he starts. And it's not really about catering to him or anything like that or making any type of statement. It's just the way the rotations line up. I think you optimize lineups better that way. I would be playing him these 22 minutes and I would increase Tari and the man to 25. And, until he plays better, you sub in Tari and the man earlier. And if this means that he comes out of the game at minute 5, which is early for any rotation pattern, so be it. But the priority is fitting in Amen and Tari in the best possible spots because they are the better players. And Jabari gets to still start as a result of Amen and Tari's best spots not exactly being within the first few minutes of the game in the starting lineup. But the main worry is how Amen and Tari fit within the rotation, and then whatever holes are left, that's where you put Jabari in. And I think once you do that, Jabari happens to be a starter.
Yeah, the reason I mention it is I think the overarching theme of these first 7 games for the Rockets, and really this season as a whole, is how do they get as many minutes as possible for Amen Thompson and Tari Eason, because it was artificially low to start the year. But I guess, and the sample is small enough that we haven't recalibrated our thought processes, or at least I haven't, there is some low-hanging fruit that you can take advantage of, such as trimming the rotation from 10 to 9, and as you mentioned, perhaps dialing Jabari back into the low to mid-20s, that can get you where you need to be at with Tari and Amen without having to disrupt from the starting lineup and any, associated politics that might come from something that drastic, and of course changing the roles and usage patterns for the team as a whole at that point. It's just, the minutes that Tari and Amen were playing early in the year were just laughably low for the quality of their projections. And, some of that was just Tari needing to be medically cleared, which he wasn't then. He is now, to play 30 plus minutes if his production in a given game warrants it. But yeah, I just think that as we go forward, finding a way to play those two guys as many minutes as possible for peak production, not necessarily as many minutes as possible. I think both of those guys, Tari in particular, are the types of players where if you tried to play them Fred VanVleet minutes, you actually could see a point of diminishing returns where they play so damn hard that, if you're asking them to go 40 minutes, that at some point it would take a toll on the overall effort level just because they play so ridiculously hard on the defensive end of the floor. And so you want them to be able to be the impact players they are in transition and go balls to the wall for every minute they're out there. So ideally, I think, something in the 25 to 32 range on a per game basis, depending on how they're playing and what the matchup is, yada, yada, is optimal. And so, perhaps they can do that without disrupting from the starting lineup. It's just, the way they started the year, trying to play 10 guys and being a little more rigid with patterns compared to last year, had me concerned a little bit but it has looked better the last few games, and so hopefully you can continue that and not have to do anything drastic, because certainly taking Shamari out of the starting lineup would probably be a hit to his confidence. Hopefully this is a discussion we don't really need to have. It's just something that's been in the back of my mind. If for some reason this team underperforms, that's a lever they could potentially pull. But we'll see. Time will tell. That's not something you need to worry with now. And to this point, the Rockets are trending upward, not just 4-3, but they've won 3 of the last 4 games. 2 of the wins against the Mavs and the Knicks, statement wins against really good teams with top shelf players. So again, it's not like you drastically need to change up anything right now. It's just if for one reason or another this team goes on a skid, that's a lever that potentially you could pull, but not something that you need to be worried about at any point in the very near future. Anyway, I think that's enough for one episode, so we'll bring this to a close here. Apologies for the 2-week break between episodes, but it's been a crazy time of year, lots of stuff going on. I promise we'll get back into the normal 7 to 10 day routine in the very near future. Until that next episode, though, this is where we'll break, and so if you want more content from Paulo or myself before we're back, the best place to get it, as always, is on Twitter/X, where I'm on there at DuBose, Paulo's on there at Paulo Alves NBA, and the show is on there at The Logger Line. Of course, if you go to that Logger Line page on Twitter/X, you can find the link tree, which has links to our distribution partners, Apple, Google, Spotify. You'd be kind enough to subscribe to one of those, leave a positive review, then, well, we would greatly appreciate it, and you would get the benefit of episodes right when they come out before I can even post them to the aforementioned social media platforms. Also, on that same link tree, you can find links to friends, sponsors, partners of the program, USA Today's Rockets Wire, Carback Brewing, Sports Talk 790. Hit up those links and you can enjoy their content as well. All right, with those plugs complete, we'll adjourn for today. For Paulo, I'm Ben. Thanks as always for listening, and please come back soon for another new episode of The Logger Line.